if you bring this technology to the hands of these artists, I really think that this will unlock a new golden age. They will no longer be blocked by budgets and by infrastructure and logistics. They can focus squarely on their vision and realizing that vision. And that's what's ultimately exciting for us.
All right, Naeem, first of all, thank you so much for making time. I know, the life of an AI building CEO is probably very busy. You probably get a lot of requests, so I appreciate your time.
No, thank you for having me.
It's an honor, man. So you got into Y Combinator in 2021, and just briefly for my audience who may not know what that is, that's kind of like the premier startup incubator that you can get into, and they give you a little funding, they take some equity, but then they really help you build like the V1 of your company. And so you got in 2021, which I don't even think AI was on my radar back then. So I'm curious what your pitch was back then.
Yeah, no, we started, we went through YC for basically a completely different company. This was, kind of 2 years-ish, I guess, ahead of Gen AI. And we were at the time working more with language models. So the company that we were working on was basically bringing language models into enterprise. And, it was kind of like a very early precursor to like ChatGPT in a lot of ways. And so we ended up being like the first business ever disrupted by LLMs, basically, once those finally came out. That company grew pretty fast for a while. We had a few thousand customers, and we were able to build some really interesting tech, but ultimately it just became outdated in like a Gen AI age, basically. So that was what we had initially gone through YC with, but YC reinvested once we started Moonvalley, and so they've continued to kind of be a part of the journey. And yeah, obviously incredible program.
Okay, cool. So you were early. I don't even know if that's early, because I've been learning LLMs have actually been around for a really long time, and then OpenAI comes along, they disrupt that. Okay, so then what was the pivot like into Moonvalley?
It was definitely interesting. After we'd kind of shut down my first company, I just went on a sabbatical for a while, bouncing around and playing with different things. And my entry into video was purely out of personal interest. I had, I started my career as a researcher. So I was a computer vision researcher when I first came out of school, at the University of Toronto. But then after that, I moved into industry and I wasn't, involved in that, but I'd spent enough time there that the research was interesting for me from like just a purely academic perspective. And then personally speaking, it's like, as a geek, I don't know if there's anything more interesting than like, I grew up watching the holodeck on Star Trek. Like that was like the holy grail of what, you could someday do. And so that's what kind of drew me into this technology. Initially it was just using the tech. So I just wanted to like have a moment, and I'm like, okay, I'm taking a break. I'm going to go and make a bunch of art, and like, I'm going to do these things. And so I was very excited to just use these tools. But when I started using them, I just, I just saw like a lot of issues in the way that these tools are being developed. And I didn't feel like the companies that were sort of building this technology were the ones who were going to kind of realize the vision and the dream of what this tech could ultimately become. And so that's what ultimately led me to kind of starting Moonvalley, just over a year and a half ago now.
Got it. So when you go to Moonvalley's website, sort of the lead is the way you train the model, right? Which is very different than a lot of these other ones. But I'm wondering, maybe you could talk a little bit about what were some of the other things not related to that you were noticing, like, oh, this isn't really there yet.
Yeah, I think like our focus at Moonvalley, we talk about production grade video. So like our entire focus is what can like serious filmmakers, professional artists and creators, what do they need to actually be able to use this tech? And that's very different from how this tech is actually being developed today. So like if you look at most applications today, either A, they're just like these research projects, right? It's like, hey, we've been working on this model and then we release it and you can use it on like a forum or something like that. Or B, it's like a very kind of consumer, like social media type application, right? It's like cool effects and stuff like that. And very little of it has actually come to the hands of the people that can get the most use out of it and actually really create things out of it, which is filmmakers. And so, a good example of that is like the most common way that you use these generative video models is text to video, right? Is like you type in a prompt and then you get a video clip out. That's really cool from an academic perspective. That's very useful from like a social media, TikTok-y type of, use case. That's next to useless for a serious filmmaker, right? Yeah. Like a serious filmmaker wants to start with storyboarding. They want to have mood boards and reference material. And, like that's how they're thinking. They're not thinking, I want to be able to just like talk into a mic and then, that creates a movie. And so, I think the thing that ultimately sets us apart is our focus is entirely on controllability. It's entirely around like, here are these workflows that, companies have and filmmakers specifically have, rather than us trying to build this whole new thing. How do we build it so it slots in each of these pieces? And so that's why like we built our first model, Mary, in collaboration with a movie studio, Asteria, who we work, in a very like, we essentially work together with them on everything that we do. And the main purpose for that is like, we're the company, I think we're the only company where it's not researchers and technologists, myself, who are deciding kind of how things need to look and what needs to be built. It's filmmakers who are deciding that. And they're basically coming to us and saying, okay, here's the real world potential application of this. Let's figure this out, rather than, oh, here's this like thing that looks really cool on a website, but is actually largely useless for us, right? And so that's kind of our focus is like, what does this actually need to in real life be for filmmakers to use it and actually get the most use out of it?
God, it's really interesting to hear you say that, because I've said a lot of the same things that, these, not all of the tools, but a lot of the tools, they're so technically mind-blowing. And I'm just floored that it's even possible to do this. But I can't imagine using it on like a client project, right? That you don't have nearly the control and it's like a slot machine, right? So I'm gonna kind of jump around here, but I'm just curious what, I have a very, very kindergarten understanding of how these tools work, right? Like I've read Stephen Wolfram's paper on LLM, so I sort of have a little bit. But so there's the training part, and then, they can sort of, using different processes, they can then create videos from that. But how do you then create controls for that a filmmaker is going to want, right? Like a lot of our students are 3D animators, so they're used to having a 3D camera that they can say, go forward, go backwards, slower, faster, maybe turn here. How difficult of a technical problem is that to solve?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, especially in the context of kind of 3D. So like the way that people have tried to solve that in the past is they'll go and they'll find something that you can kind of call control. So let's say like the common example is like camera controls. And so they'll say, okay, let's build in zooming in and zooming out. We want to teach this model how to do that. The way that you go and do that is you go and find a bunch of videos that have zoom ins and that have zoom outs, and then you just train that into the model, and then you caption it as like a zoom in or a zoom out. Like that is as sophisticated as control has generally gotten in these models. And so to your point, at most what you can do with that approach is kind of teach your model what a zoom in is. But that's sort of it. How much to zoom in, what speed, where, am I doing different types of motions? Like forget about doing like complex gimbal movements with this approach, right? Like there's no way you can do that. The approach that we're taking is actually, and this is why it was kind of interesting that you bring up the 3D is, and internally we describe our models as 3D aware, like building 3D aware video models. Is the issue is today video models are just learning on 2D data, and so they aren't able to introduce that level of control that you mentioned. What we're doing is actually training it with 3D data. And so we've actually created this engine, and we have a whole team of veterans from like primarily the video game industry, that have been building this sort of simulation engine, essentially. And that engine is what we're using to essentially teach our models to start to reason and think and understand in 3D. And so what that enables us to do is now, instead of just like throwing in arbitrary videos of zooms, we're teaching it, this is what a 1x zoom looks like. This is what a 2x zoom looks like. This is what a 3x zoom looks like. This is what like this, we have a laundry list of like 36 different types of motions. And, camera movements and things, and also learning how to do those with precision to be like, okay, this this zoom will, I want to target my zoom to this part of the scene, or I want to mix things. I want to start off with a pan and then I want to zoom. So that level of precision, to your point, it comes from 3D. It's not something that you can just like bake into it the way that people have been trying to do. So we spent we've spent 6-7 months basically building this synthetic simulation engine. And you actually see similar things in like the world of self-driving cars. That's how companies like Waymo, for instance, have been like teaching their cars their models how to do like more precise things. You can learn general movements by just driving around and collecting data, but if you wanted to learn, well, this is exactly what a 3-point turn looks like, that's where the simulation environment comes in. And so that's kind of how we're building it as well. And the goal is that over time, you'll be able to have the same amount of precision that you can have on a 3D environment today, you can have over a generative video environment in the future. And in our eyes, that's the only way that this stuff can actually become, really useful in large production workloads.
Wow. Well, that does sound like what it's going to take, to really, like, I'm thinking of the opening shot of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, right. Steven Spielberg, one of the best, like camera people ever in history. And it's like focus here, then pan up, and right then something happens, and then whip pan over here. And so I guess another part of that is, and probably what a lot of our students specifically are worried about is like, well, you have to have Steven Spielberg to even think of that idea, right? Once you have that idea, well, you can either go out and spend $1 million on actors and sets and this and that, or maybe one day Moonvalley's model lets you do that. What about the first part? Like actually knowing what a good shot is like, and this is kind of tied into like, what is your vision for this? Because, some of the other models, it's kind of tough to say what their vision is because it almost looks like they're trying to say, you can just type in something and we'll come up with a good idea and show it to you. That's not really what artists want. And what artists want may or may not matter in the long term. I don't really know. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on that and what your vision is for like, where does the artist have to bring it to before the AI can actually take over?
I think that the Indiana Jones example is such a beautiful example of that because we're not talking about dialogue. We're not talking about story. We're talking about like this and yet it's such a signature, like it's such a moment, it's a historic moment in film. AI will never be able to do that. and it's grossly irresponsible for companies that think that it will, because it won't. That's not how, these are all like to believe that AI can do that, you would have to not understand the value of human creativity, right? And not understand. It's like, Ben Stiller said recently, which I think was beautiful at an event. He's like, AI doesn't have taste. And that's bang on, right? Like AI does not have taste. So AI will be able to average out camera movements and it'll be able to do something that, approximates what it's seen other people do. That's not what Steven Spielberg's doing, right? Correct. He's not approximating what other people are doing. And so, ultimately that's philosophically probably the biggest difference between us and others in the space is that, there was a company and, not to name names, but they released a press release very early on where they were like, suddenly anybody with a mobile phone will someday be able to be James Cameron. And we're like, that is insane. Like somebody with a phone, it's true, will soon be able to have capabilities that you might have before needed, a lot more infrastructure to pull off. That doesn't mean that they'll be able to use that to actually do anything people want to look at, right? Like nobody wants to watch a movie I made. Like it's, that's like, but what this stuff is going to enable is the people that do have that artistry, right? The folks, for instance, like the folks that you work with, the ones who have that creativity, that taste, that artistry that I don't have, they will now have the ability to do things that otherwise they would have always been budget constrained by. And so ultimately, when done right, we see this as being a moment in time of basically an unlocking event for the artist, because suddenly the artist will become at the center of it. They no longer have to be, well, I can only realize this vision if I'm able to get all of this financial backing from this studio, if I'm able to, like, all these deep constraints that they used to have are now going to become loosened. And so what's going to happen is the Spielbergs and the Camerons of the world will now be able to do things that they couldn't think of before, right? Imagine if James Cameron had 4x the budget that he had for the first Avatar movie. What would that look like, right? And so I think all that's going to happen, if this is done properly, is that the layer of sophistication of the art is just going to increase. And so the layer at the bottom, and this is why I think the group that I'm most excited by is like independent studios and independent filmmakers, is they're the ones who will really be able to punch above their weights now. Because before, independent filmmakers were stuck making independent films, right? They would be very restricted. And obviously, once you had digital cameras and stuff, that started opening things up a little bit. But your average independent filmmaker, it's going to be very difficult for them to go and make a AAA production, right? They need to know people, they need access, they need all these different things. But now suddenly those, the 10 other Spielbergs who exist in the world that have the talent, but that don't have the access and the resources, they're the ones who will now be able to do things that we haven't been able to see before. So, I follow what John Carmack kind of, like his analogy to me is the best, where he says, AI needs to be power tools, and that's all it is, right? Like, yeah, technically it could drill a hole by itself, but nobody wants to see that, right? Like it has the capability of automating stuff. That doesn't mean anything, right? What actually matters is if you bring this technology to the hands of these artists, we'll now be able to. I really think that this will unlock a new golden age where you'll now just have this kind of democratization of creativity, where the people with the real taste and the artistry and the creativity, they will no longer be blocked by budgets and by infrastructure and logistics. They can focus squarely on their vision and realizing that vision. And that's what's ultimately exciting for us.
Yeah, I see a lot of correlation between what's happening with AI and what happened with CG in like the late
100%.
90s, right? And a lot of the same kind of objections to CG. You hear about AI, it doesn't look that good yet. It's slow. I have a kind of a random question I've always wanted to ask someone in your position, which is about the term AI, because sometimes I feel like it's the wrong word. It has a lot of Okay, do you? Okay, yeah. What some of your thoughts on that word? Yeah,
I hate that word. It's it just has so much baggage attached to it, and we're also getting to the point where it's like, you can make the argument for AI, for like an LLM of sophisticate, enough reasoning, especially with some of these new reasoning and kind of MOE type models, that they're actually thinking, and, there's something mimicking thinking. You can make the argument that that's AI. I don't know how a model that's generating images is AI, right? Like it's not intelligence. What you've built is just like a very sophisticated statistical model that's able to predict the next pixel that a human would create. Like that's what these models are, right? And so I think that AI is a very damaging term. I think ML at least is a more accurate term. Like calling it machine learning is more, more kind of in line. And 100%, all this stuff is an extension of CGI. Like it's and there's things that people are doing and getting wowed by generative AI models today that you can already do with CGI, often even easier and faster than you could do with these models, right? And so we really, and I think that sort of broad, like that categorization of this as being AI is one of the biggest reasons why there's so much justified antagonism towards it, when in reality we should be looking at it as like, one of the biggest things that you can do with AI is style transfer, right? Is like, you take an input video and then translate it into whatever, and like that's just green screen. Like it's an exact, kind of extension of what's already been done. And unfortunately, calling it, kind of the next iteration of CGI doesn't make the marketing headlines, and it doesn't, ring loudly on that side. Whereas if you can claim that you're building AGI, then obviously that becomes a lot.
It doesn't
more.
get the VCs as excited.
It doesn't get people excited in that way, unfortunately. But from a user perspective, that's all it is. It's super CGI.
Yeah. I mean, we have a 3D creative director on staff, EJ, and we've talked about this stuff, and like we've even called AI or let's come up with another word at some time, but we almost call it like it's a render engine in a sense. And it's funny because the way you're describing the way you're building your model, where it's 3D aware, I assume underneath where the user maybe in the interface they see it, maybe they don't, but there's a 3D representation of what's happening so that an artist, a cinematographer can control that. What's the rest of the vision, right? So, okay, so we need to be able to control cameras. I know there's things that AI is, sort of, it's seemingly not great at. Like, okay, I want this character to always look like this character. Their ears a little bigger here. When they turn their head, they look different. Are you also having to solve those problems at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. You've kind of hit on like the two big categories of problems. One is kind of spatial control. So that involves like camera, trajectories, lighting, like the physical movements and the motions of the scene. And then the other one is conditioning and consistency. So being able to, I have characters, as part of our model, we're also building this like companion software engine, essentially. And we literally call it a rendering engine, as you said. Like that's exactly how we think about it as well. And so within that engine, you have, for instance, like a character creator and an asset library. So here are my characters, here's my sets, here's my objects and things. And then you just like render scenes. So like here's, I'm at a tavern and I have these two characters here. And then, I want them to move in this direction. We look at it as being like the form factor for this to ultimately be very similar to working with 3D, or even using like game engines like Unity and Unreal. Obviously, with generative AI, these things can be a lot simpler. You don't need quite as much tuning and things to, do like simple movements. But ultimately, that's how we think about it. And so when we think about it in like the production process, we look at it as we're building it literally as this rendering engine that you would kind of go into to create your scenes, pull them out, and then bring them into your Resolve or your, Premiere Pro or whatever the rest of your kind of workflow looks like. So at a high level, that's how we're thinking about it. And then, I think that there's going to be no end to the amount of controllability that you'll ultimately need to build. But I think that the broad strokes for us are: can you get consistency of character and objects and temporality? Can you have granular control over motion, so camera motion, trajectory, fine motor control, etc.? And then 3, can you actually project out scenes and direct them? Like, it's easy to do all of these different things, but I want XYZ thing to actually happen in the scene. Can I do that with a high degree of confidence? Or to your point, am I playing slot machines every time? Right. Yeah. And so I think that once you get to that level where you have enough kind of control and fidelity over each of these different places, where I can say, these are going to be my characters, they're going to look consistent, they're going to match the environment, they're going to do all these different things, and they're going to follow the narrative that I'm creating. And then, I can also go into each like scene and then make like individual manipulations. That's where I think you'll really get to the point where you can start using this as like the foundation for, next generation of kind of entertainment and media.
Yeah. So I can totally imagine, the 3D app metaphor kind of works perfectly for controlling certain things. And then, maybe the next level is performance. So, you've got your character, you want them to perform. Maybe there's a dialogue scene. I've always seen on social media when people post stuff, they're like, now do a dialogue scene. And these models can't really do it well because the voices, the performance, the little micro facial animations, they're not there. And I know a little bit more about character animation, the amount of work it takes to make a compelling, like just 5 seconds of like someone talking might take 2 weeks. And so are there other approaches to that you guys are looking at, like actually using actors, or is there some other way where you can say this is a sad scene, so the way you deliver this line, how would that work like as a director?
Yeah, for sure. So that's another really interesting one, because I think that's another good example where like the angle that like researchers and technologists take often deviates pretty far from where like the artist would take it, right? And so the standard research approach has been to kind of reinvent the wheel along those lines, and basically like they're just like training on millions of videos of people talking and trying to learn how to match. And the issue with these models is that one thing that they're not great at is precision. So like and that's kind of the control problem as well, is like it's able to learn broadly, and it's able to learn a lot of things that way. But to get it to learn specific things is very challenging. And so that's one of the reasons why, yeah, anytime you see these like AI generated talking heads or whatever, it's very technically interesting, but you just know you're in uncanny valley immediately, right? And it's just, it doesn't have that at all. Our approach is we're focusing on, exactly as you said, we're focusing on the actors. So we're saying, okay, instead of doing that, how do we translate actual motion capture video from actors into generative environments and minimize the amount of loss that you basically have, right? And so we're investing a lot of time into these sort of pose control and style control models and adapters that essentially do exactly that. Is like they're tracking all the facial movements of an actor that you can then project into other scenes. And there, to your point, like there is already a lot of research there that's been done very successfully in 3D and animation and in gaming and different areas. And so it ends up not, we're not having to kind of reinvent the wheel. So what you can't do with our models is generate like a bunch of AI characters talking or whatever. We can't do that. We have no interest in doing that. We have no plans of doing that, right? Instead, we're doing this. Our models are being used in this small production that Natasha Leone is working on. And one thing that she's testing out, which has actually worked quite well, is just like doing like acting on camera. So essentially they're doing their table reads and they're filming themselves doing that. And it's similar to being a voice actor in a way, but obviously you're kind of bringing the full animation. And then let's translate that into what it actually needs to be, at the end of the day. And so the inputs then become, you still have the actor who is still doing all the acting, and you still have the VFX folks that are involved in that are now heavily focused on, let's get the reference material here correct. Let's figure out exactly what the scene looks like that we're translating them to. What are the lighting, the colors, the textures, the materials? Let's photograph that scene and then give it to the model to then take the actor to take this reference material. And now you've got a brand new scene. And so definitely, I think that, I'm not a big fan of like AI driven dialogue. I think eventually you'll be able to solve that to an extent, but I think it's one of those things that there's no point in solving it. Like there's so much, there's just like the majesty of human voice and you're not going to replicate those performances with AI. That's never going to happen. And so I think that it's a fool's errand to try and do it, even if technically you might get there. Nobody's going to be interested in watching this or listening to this, right?
Yeah. So one of the sort of objections to that I've heard is that, and the way you're talking, I kind of see the other side of it is, because of like AI is one kind of force that's out there right now, but there's also just other forces that are impacting, say, marketing, right? Where marketing budgets are being spent less on these big high prestige $1 million commercials and these big expensive videos for startups, and they're going to like TikTok influencers so they can take selfies with their phone. And so there's a little bit of a worry, at least in our industry, that the bar for creativity can be a lot lower than it has been in the past for certain kinds of content. And so, I don't want to single out Runway, but this first one that popped into my head, like a lot of the stuff that I see come out of it, it's very cool, but it's very lifeless and dead. And, it takes a lot of work and a lot of generations to get anything decent out of it. But is that okay? Is that enough for like this new world of marketing? But it sounds like what you're aiming at is kind of a different market. So I guess my question is, who are you aiming at? And are you aiming at a totally different thing than these other places?
The lazy answer is we're aiming, everywhere. And the reason that I say that is I think that the entire dynamic is going to change if it's done properly. So marketing, I think, is an amazing example that you mentioned. The reason that you've had this kind of perceived bar lowering is because if you're in marketing or brand, or you're trying to, create content, you can say, okay, my two options are, I can work with these amazing creators to do like incredible branded content. That's going to eat up 300% of my budget. Or I can do this like UGC stuff, which isn't necessarily what I'm very excited by and isn't necessarily going to be this like market moving, material, but it's 1/100th of the cost of the other thing. And so I may as well do this, right? Especially as, to your point, like marketing budgets are being compressed and, different pressures are there. I think that's where things start to become really interesting in a post-generative world, where suddenly that question mark starts to go away again. And suddenly it starts to become a question of, okay, if I'm a brand, well, now these creative agencies, these independent creators who have the ability to do these things are now able to do them at a budget and a place that makes a lot more sense for brands, right? And that's where I think like what you're going to have is an opening up of the market rather than a shrinking of the market. So before, like today, you might have 10 agencies in a given vertical, let's say, that have any ability to there's only enough business available for 10 agencies, right? What you'll have in like a post-generative age, I hope, if done correctly, is that you'll have this entirely new layer of another 100 agencies that had the ability, the skills, the creative talent, and everything else. They just weren't able to absorb that demand because of the starting costs of doing any of this, right? It's like, I can't justify going into this industry unless I'm spending $100,000 just getting started on, my basic, kind of structures and equipment and things. And so the market had such a high barrier to entry. You had very little kind of supply. And so the price was so high that it wasn't able to meet all that demand. Now that supply is going to unlock a little bit, not significantly, but enough that you'll go from, let's say, 10 agencies to, let's say, 100 agencies. Now that demand is going to open up significantly, right? And so the demand is there, and it's always kind of been there. The demand has always been there for really high quality content, and the creators have always been around that can serve that. It's just you have all these logistical things in the middle that have made it challenging for them to do that. And I think that these generative tools will ultimately make that a lot easier. And so what you should hopefully see is much more interesting commercials, much more interesting branded content, much more interesting actual film and entertainment. Like you'll start to see the best, the kind of cream really rise to the top, rather than being artificially kind of deflated by, a lack of access or a lack of infrastructure or whatever it is.
Yeah. You reminded me of something that I just learned about called Jevons paradox. Have you ever heard of this?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so it's interesting. Basically, it's named after this guy Jevon who lived in the 1800s, and he noticed that trains were like really expensive to ride because they took a ton of coal to run. And then some technological innovation made it where you could use way less coal. And all the coal manufacturers were really freaked out because, now we're going to sell less coal. But what actually happened was it drove the price of trains down, and then train usage exploded. Yeah. And the same thing happened with CG. And so I have had that thought. I'm curious what you think, that like, if AI does really make it much easier to make high-end looking content, you still have to have the artistry and the idea and the taste. Does that just mean way more content too? Because the demand, you're saying, the demand may be there. There's just, it's too expensive right now to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah, 100%. I think that look, everybody has had, and I think especially actual artists themselves have noticed this sort of, on one hand, there's been this common sentiment that Hollywood or whatever has been kind of stagnating over the past decade or two. And maybe we're sort of past that golden age. On the other hand, you have a community of artists that you've never had before. Like the amount of really talented artists that exist today is orders of magnitude more than has ever been there in the past, right? And this is like a really weird disconnect. It's like, why is the big screen feel to so many people to be stale, when at the same time, if you look at like independent communities, you're seeing a flourishing of artistry and activity that you've never seen before, right? And I think that's exactly like that. I love that. I'm going to start mentioning that paradox, and
yeah, it's great. It blew my mind when I saw it. Yeah,
I love that. That's exactly it. I think that there's so many people in the world, and today we're all like, everybody's consuming a very small amount of content that's coming from a handful of places that have the access and the ability to do that, right? There's 8 billion people in the world. There's no shortage of unique content, and I think that's ultimately what's exciting here, is that we don't need another superhero movie, right? Like, it's great and that's there, but like, these new stories are now going to be able to be told. There's this filmmaker that we've been in touch with recently, based out of the Senegal, and he's been creating. So he's been a filmmaker for a better part of a decade, and his focus is on very like local kind of things. And one thing that he's always done is like music videos. He loves like Senegalese artists, and they have this kind of local like Afrobeat hip hop type sort of scene, and traditionally he's just kind of done this like iPhone videography, and it's just been kind of these generic sort of low budget looking, videos that haven't like gone beyond their just like very local scope. Lately he's gone really deep into using generative tools to kind of buffer his workflows. And he's now started creating some of these videos that like, I think one of his videos got like 10 million views on YouTube. And, wow. Before that he was getting like 1,000 views if he was lucky, right? On something. And this is like 10 million international views of people coming in. And it was this like crazy video of like, it was sort of this mix of voodoo and then modernism. And it was this fascinating story from this fascinating context. And I'm like, I would never see this before, right? And now suddenly that's being unlocked. And I think that's what's going to be really exciting is people like that have that taste and that artistry that can now really bring it out. And that's what I think we're excited about.
Dude, I love that story. And I think, I want to hear more stories like that too, because I think, a lot of what I hear sort of just, running a school that teaches animation primarily for marketing and advertising is, and I'm aware that like when you hear like the fear coming at you from social media, like, this is unethical, this is going to take jobs, all that kind of stuff. And I think some of that is probably valid for sure. But what you don't hear is what you just said, that like there's a dude in Senegal, like compared to the United States, pretty poor country, who doesn't have the budget to make stuff look really high end. And maybe these tools let someone with an amazing eye and vision and cool ideas make something that looks, like it cost $1 million. I think that's incredible. So imagining, I haven't used your model or your tool, it's not available publicly yet, but I'm trying to imagine what it's like, right? Like, so the biggest issue I have, so I use Midjourney and, I use the new 4.0 model at OpenAI. I use that stuff for ideation. We use it for our YouTube thumbnails. We have tools that have trained a model of me. So for the YouTube face, we can change how I look. We're doing that kind of stuff. All of it's very slow and very clunky. And when you get into video, like I've used Pika a few times just because it's fun. Exactly like you said, it's a toy, right? It's like you can make yourself turn into a marshmallow and get squished. That's a novelty. It's great.
Right.
It's great for some clicks. But even that, I'm waiting 10 minutes, right? For like a little low res video that may or may not be okay. And it always gives you two because it knows one probably isn't going to be very good. And so really, there's this other kind of revolution happening in our industry of using real-time 3D render engines like Unreal. And I'm curious, is that kind of the long-term vision? Like this is more or less real-time and you're moving a 3D camera around, but instead of having a 3D render engine, it's an AI render engine, and it just looks like you're on set directing.
100%. 100%. I think that and there's a lot of research that's already being able to do that pretty effectively. You see it kind of in, I don't know, I'm sure you've seen some of these like world model type things that have come out where it's sort of like rendering the environment as you move through the environment kind of thing. And so the research is certainly there. I think the challenge right now is if you're a research lab, you can prioritize one of two things. So either you're prioritizing just like quality and improving, the overall fidelity, or you're able to optimize around speed. And so, us, like most people, are having to focus on quality initially, get to a certain bar, and then sort of optimize on the speed. I think in the short term, over the next year, this will continue to be a challenge. It's going to take you a couple minutes to generate a clip, and that's going to be frustrating as hell, right? However, I think that it's sort of like the days are long, the years are short kind of thing, which is in the very short term, is that going to change much? No. However, I think that if you're using these models towards, let's say, this time next year or towards, Q3, Q4 of next year, suddenly I think you're going to have a very, very different experience that's much closer to that kind of real-time iteration and real-time availability. And you can kind of see it. I think Midjourney had that new, like the turbo or whatever mode where you can kind of iterate, and we're starting to get there. It's going to take some time. Our focus is even harder in that sense because we're trying to focus entirely on quality. So our models are just bigger and louder and much more expensive to run. But it's going to get there. I think that one thing that's become clear in the last few years is the GPUs are still scaling faster than the technology can keep up, which for the moment continues to be true. And that's just a good thing for the industry as a whole. So yeah, I'm hoping that, a year from now, you'll be able to do incredibly high quality generations, in a fraction of the time that it takes today, in a much more iterative and real time kind of way. That's the goal.
So I'd like to understand a little bit better what the technical challenge is to make these things real time. Because, based on my limited knowledge, if you like, we can use ChatGPT as an example, just because it's like, I think it's a little bit easier conceptually to wrap my head around. You type in a prompt and it runs a billion math problems like as fast as it can. And it's using, 100,000 GPUs to do this. There's these stories, Elon Musk builds Grok and he spins up this enormous warehouse just filled with GPUs, water cooled, all this stuff. And, GPUs are kind of getting ridiculous now. They're very fast. They're very powerful. Is it just a matter of we need them to be 10 times more powerful than they are? Or is there some architectural, thing that needs to be figured out before this can actually run fast enough?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. So the first piece is, it's I think a billion math problems is a good way of putting it. I would say that it's probably more like a trillion math problems now for ChatGPT, and the math problems are like second year differential calculus and that kind of linear algebra stuff. So it is quite remarkable, I think, the scale that these have gotten to. And video is interesting because video models are using the same base transformer models that language models use. And the way you can kind of think about it is every letter that ChatGPT generates is like a token. A token is more than one letter, but let's say one letter. The equivalent in video would be essentially a frame. And then within the frame, each pixel is being generated separately in that same sequence. So imagine you're doing a billion math problems per pixel basically to try and get it. And so the sheer horsepower of compute is definitely a part of it. However, it's hard to say how long that's going to last. The leaps that especially NVIDIA machines have taken in the last couple of years, there's, most models today are using the series of GPUs known as Hopper GPUs. So it's H100s are the most common one. Some people have started using H200s lately, which are more cutting edge. And just to kind of give you some context, the next model, so the H100s are roughly in line memory-wise with A100s, which were around back in 2020. So that's the frontier. Most video models you see today were trained on H100s, which is a big leap, but it's not a massive leap and has the same memory as the same machine as GPT-2. The next machine that's coming out, some people are even getting it in the next few months, is the Blackwell series that NVIDIA calls them. Although it hasn't been fully tested yet, theoretically, you can fit 14 times as much memory into these as you're able to do in the Hopper series. It's just an insane, and so, I'm sure you've heard these parameter count things of theoretically GPT-4 is a 1 trillion parameter. Well, theoretically, this means that now we should be able to have a 14 trillion parameter large language model. And so it's just, the compute is definitely a big part of it. The other part is also definitely architectural, just in the sense of we know what it takes to make these faster. We just don't have the time yet to do it. And for better or for worse, right now, there's really only a handful of foundational research labs that are working on these models. And so, it feels like there's so much happening in, let's say, LLMs. But when you really look at it, there's probably 6 or 7, research groups and companies that are actually able to work on these problems. And so unfortunately that means that things take time. And I think optimization on the speed is one of those examples, as there's maybe 5 or 6 companies working on foundational video models. And so you either place your very limited bets on quality or your very limited bets on real time. And I think right now the focus is more on quality, but there's companies like LTX that have shown a lot of promise in the real-time side, and it's going to be coming soon.
Wow. I can't imagine what those Blackwells are going to cost too. They're going to be a couple of bucks.
Yeah, I try not to think about that too much. But
yeah, that's that's when you go for the Series C, Series D. So I want to start to get into the thing that seems to be the big, at least for now, it's kind of the biggest marketing point that you guys are pushing. That the way you train your model is different. Yeah. But I want to start with sort of what it even means to train a model, because when we started seeing all of this stuff, especially artists in the industry, and there was recently kind of this controversy. I mean, it was a Twitter controversy, so you take it with a grain of salt. But when the new ChatGPT model came out that could now do perfect Studio Ghibli, all that stuff, right? So if you don't know how they work, I think it's pretty easy to assume, and I think a lot of artists kind of understand this isn't really what's going on, but it seems like they're looking at all this work that doesn't belong to them, artists' work, and then it's like copying it. Like there's a copy of my JPEG from my website in that model somewhere, and when it needs to, it grabs a few pixels from it and collages together something that looks totally new, but it's built off my work, and it's just copying. And I know that that's not exactly what's happening, but I don't really know how to explain it. So I'm wondering if maybe you can attempt to teach us how that works. Before we get to that answer, let me tell you about School Motion All Access. All Access is a new program from us where you can take any of our classes that we offer anytime you want. You can learn After Effects, Cinema 4D, Photoshop, Illustrator, Rive, Unreal Engine, design, animation, visual effects, expressions, so much more. You can do it all with real human artists helping you along the way. Our one-of-a-kind training platform enables you to go through training at your own pace, but to also get personalized, tactical feedback on every single project you upload from one of our amazing teaching assistants. You'll also get to join our 24/7 hyper-engaged worldwide community of artists who are all on the same learning journey as you. You'll get exclusive access to live events, guest speakers, and portfolio reviews. You can earn verified credentials from us if you complete a course, and our credentials actually mean something because you've done work. Plus, we're one of the only online schools on earth to be both Adobe and Maxon certified. And if you're part of a team of 3 or more, you can join our team training program for All Access, giving you dashboards to track your team's progress, floating seats, consolidated billing, priority support, and more. So reach out on our team training page to get more information about that, and make sure you check out School Motion All Access. We are incredibly proud of it, and we hope to see you in class.
Yeah, it is interesting because the models don't actually have the ability to really replicate. This is a kind of like a somewhat of a common misunderstanding of the models, is that they don't actually learn. Like they're not just like learning in the sense that it can repeat it, right? And so it is actually non-trivial. So like you can take our model, for instance, and give it the exact prompt of, let's say, a video clip that it learned from, and it'll generate a completely new video clip, right? It's basically impossible to get it to generate that exact clip. And this isn't overall true, but that's generally true. And the reason for that is what these models are doing is basically learning an underlying distribution of how language maps to visuals and imagery. And the long term of this is why, like, my chief scientist, Matej, his belief is that, and a lot of people agree with this, is that real quote unquote AGI is going to come from these image and video models, not from LLMs. Because what these image and video models are doing is they're understanding the world in the context of like how we look at it visually, right? And so what these models are really doing is they're learning. The best example I can think of is like, I don't know if you know, like the Fibonacci sequence. It's like the set of numbers that seem to show up a lot in nature. What these models are really doing is they're learning this like very deep Fibonacci sequence that governs kind of the visual rules of our universe. That's really what they're doing. And so they're learning that, like, hey, this language maps to this. And so what the fascinating emergent behavior of a lot of these models is, they're learning things. They're learning, for instance, our model, we've found that it understands some physics that we've never taught it. Like we found that, like, in fluid mechanics, especially, there's certain behaviors, like it knows how to model water in a way that it shouldn't be able to, because it hasn't seen enough videos or whatever on water to be able to do that, right? And if we wanted to teach that to a 3D model, it would be much more complicated, but this model just knows how to do that. And the reason that it does is it's learning these, like, little distributions of how visuals work and how they pair with language, which is quite fascinating when you really think about it in the grand scheme of things. Is these are models that are learning essentially, like, the underlying math behind the universe. That's like, and in the grand scheme of things, that's what these models are learning. Now, the fact is, if you learn enough of that math, you are able to replicate certain things. It's like the whole thing of, like, well, within, I mean, this is a terrible example, but, like, within the letters of pi, you can find Shakespeare, right? It's like, technically that's true. And of course, these models are being biased in that direction. So they're learning about artwork and they're being able to replicate artwork. In my eyes, I think if you look 100 years from now, I think people are just going to be thinking about AI very differently. I think that this conflict that we have today, I don't think is going to exist with, like, 2 generations down from us, because the way we think about what AI is and what it means is just going to fundamentally change. However, I think that intent matters more than anything else. And I think that that's the big problem. I don't think the issue that artists have with this is that, these models are, quote unquote, training on this art. I think the problem that they have on it is, not only are these models being trained on their art, but they're being told to just accept it. They're being told to find new jobs. They're being told that their art is commodified. Like, I think that intent is the real driving issue here, because the truth of it is, a lot of it is already covered with existing copyright law. Even if my model learned from your video, it's, the law today covers you if I try to replicate what you've created, right? And so a lot of that output protections are there, and at least for now, and obviously we've heard the stories of people trying to remove that, and I think that's, the usual suspects, obviously. But, I think that the core, the crux of it is, and this is why for us it was so important to figure out a way of doing this the right way, is that ultimately, and this is, one of the things you mentioned at the beginning of the call, is when I said that I don't like the word ethical models. The reason that I don't like that phrasing is that, the world, like, my opinion of what's an ethical model is meaningless. Like, the world would be a lot better if tech CEOs would shut up and not, like, give their opinion on things like these. The reason that I don't like ethical models is that it's not for us to know or decide what's ethical or not. What matters is what matters to the artist. What do they care about? What's important to them? And what do they need for them to actually get excited about this technology, right? And I think that that's a very different conversation. And so when we talk to artists and filmmakers, most artists and filmmakers actually are excited about this tech. The first people who were excited when they saw this stuff was filmmakers, was artists, when they were like, oh, I can imagine all these new things that you couldn't do before. The issue was when this tech started being applied, it was, oh, well, now you can just become James Cameron with your phone. Like, that's the way that this stuff became positioned. So of course artists are going to become hostile. Why wouldn't they? Right? Because the companies that have been doing this to date have been trying to replace artists. It's being led by people who do believe that artistry is just you can replace it with an algorithm. And if you believe that, then that's how you're going to build your company. That's how you're going to proceed. I think that if you do it the right way and you do it alongside the artists and you're saying, look, this model is going to learn from your data, just like if it was a robot walking around and looking at artwork, right? However, you should have the ability to shut that door and not let that robot in, right? And you should be able to decide whether that to be compensated if you do allow that robot in, right? That's the first like fundamental step that has to be there. And then the next part of it is when you're actually building this model, do it with filmmakers. Like why are these companies being built with just like a bunch of technologists and scientists in San Francisco releasing these models and then sending it out and saying, we have disrupted art. Like all the art that you've been doing for 500,000 years, we're not doing that anymore. This is like, we have changed how it's crazy. Instead, it needs to be, okay, filmmakers, artists, etc. What do you want from this tech? Like, what of this technology is going to allow you to do things that you couldn't do before? That's where we need to be spending our time. So I think that our industry has a lot of work to do to rebuild the trust with artists and with creators. And ultimately, none of this tech is going to be meaningful in the long term unless it has artists and creators at the center of it. And for us, it's as much a business decision as much as it is just like this is how it should be. And if there's a chance at doing this and showing that you can do this, then we would be remiss not to do that and not to go after it in that way.
Man, you're making me think all philosophically here, because and you kind of answered it right at the end there. My what I was thinking when you're talking was everything you're saying. That's what artists want to hear, right? And so it's amazing to hear someone like you say it. But I also know that I know it costs a lot of money to train these models. And I know that building a company is very hard, and you've got investors and they expect a return at some point, or they hope for one. And I imagine, maybe you would put it differently, but you're kind of at a disadvantage to the ones that are not thinking the way you are. It's kind of it's not anti-capitalistic, but it's like capitalism, if you kind of take it to its logical conclusion, is like, well, whatever extracts the most, profit for the shareholders, right? But what you're talking about is, well, we're going to spend more money that other companies are not spending to pay artists to let us, train on their stuff. And they don't have to, right? And if they say no, we won't do it. And and then we're going to build tools that are going to be expensive in R&D so that they can control those things and not just make something that looks really great in a TechCrunch article or something like that. How is there any tension like that as you're building this company?
100%. But I think that for us, and this is another reason why I'm not a fan of like the ethical model framing, is I think that with that word, there's almost this sense of like one or the other. It's like you can either have ethical or you can have good kind of thing. And what we've set out to do with this Mary model that we launched is to show that this is the first time that a frontier state-of-the-art generative model, whether it's LLMs, whether it's image or video models, has been trained entirely with clean data. And the main thing that we're trying to prove there is not only that it's possible, but that there's actually massive business advantages if you do it this way. For starters, one of the biggest advantages with working with clean data is that the data is generally much higher quality, because we're not going out and just blanket scraping the internet. We're going out to actual sources. We're going to filmmakers and studios and these different places. And so they're automatically basically curating the data for us, right? And so on average, the type of data that our model sees is much higher quality than if we went out and we just like blanketed a bunch of places. And so certainly there's expenses attached to it, but I think what we're finding is that there's obvious benefits of just, if the community likes you and they like the way that you're doing things, you can't put a price on that, first of all. And second of all is, what you can put a price on is, the data costs us a lot of money and a lot of resources to go out and do it. But the net result is we have a data set that's much higher quality and much more curated than anybody else does. And, I think that like with LLMs, it can be a little bit tougher just because the volume of the data that you need with LLMs is like, there aren't enough words in the universe to train these things anymore. So there it's, I think, a little bit tougher. But with media, with image models and video models, our model is perfect proof that you don't have to go out and scrape the internet and say that like, oh, copyright law is just going to prevent us from doing this. And in reality, like our model is best in class. It's state of the art using this kind of data. And it's not like, we've probably raised the least amount of money of any of our competitors to date, right? There's a lot of advantages, inherent advantages. And I think after our model comes out into GA and starts to kind of hit the mainstream, I think you'll start seeing more and more companies that'll start to do that, is they'll realize that what you're paying for is not clean ethical data. What you're really paying for is curated data. And that is worth its weight in gold in this kind of world, right? And our hope is that that becomes a mainstream belief. And, that's the kind of capitalism that ultimately I hope we can move towards, where, it's something that benefits the creators as much as it benefits the companies. And to your point, like, for it to be scalable, that's the only way for it to really be scalable. It wouldn't work otherwise.
Yeah, dude, I really love that. Yeah, and now I'm really rooting for you guys. So my intuition, like you already mentioned, if you're training an LLM, OpenAI has already scraped the entire open internet multiple times over, and now they're licensing things from like the New York Times and whoever they can get, whatever data they can get their hands on. They need more and more and more. And so my understanding was that like that's the primary way that you improve a model is you train it on more things, so it has more data points, builds a more elaborate algorithm. So now trillions of calculations and quadrillions and. I would have assumed video would be way harder than that because, like you said, there's like in a 4K image, I mean, there's, 4,000 pixels across. And I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? But why is that not the case? Because you made it sound like it's actually a little bit easier. You need less data than you think.
Yeah. So with LLMs, the easiest way to think of it is that LLMs tend to be a lot more horizontal, whereas video and image models tend to be a lot more vertical. So what that means is like with LLMs, like a cardinal sin in training large language models is that you should never train on the same data twice. And so that's why like volume is so important, is that you want the model to learn as wide of an understanding as possible between the relationships of different words and different sentences and different phrases. And so from an LLM's perspective, it's much more about learning, just those like those lexical permutations, right? Of like, these are all the different kind of combinations and permutations of words with which, kind of go into the nth power. With video models, and image models is different because you're optimizing for something a little bit differently. So you're not really trying to optimize for, a model that knows every different combination of pixels. What you're really trying to optimize for is, A, does it more or less match the input conditions? And B, does it look good? And that second piece is really the important piece. And that's why, for instance, Midjourney models have been so popular, despite, let's say, OpenAI's DALL-E models being like, we don't know officially, but there was talk at one point that it was almost 10 times bigger than the Midjourney model, right? Is because you can build bigger and bigger models the way that you do with LLMs, but all that it's really going to do is teach the model to learn more about like these like very intricate patterns and pixel distributions and things like that, when in reality, you don't really need it to know that much. You need it to just have a general idea of like, what are the standard types of visuals, right? What's the general visual language that matter to filmmakers? What are like the few different types of motions or movements that are important? And those are things that are much easier to learn. It's a much more finite amount of things to learn than, you want to build a reasoning machine essentially that learns that learns intelligence. Now, I think that the difference is you have companies that are trying to do world models now, which is they're building these models bigger and bigger to become like the brains for robots, basically. And in that world, you do need that level of scale because you need them to understand how every possible object interacts with every other possible object, right? But in our world, we don't need that, right? Like our thing is, you need to get that first kind of 60, 70, 80%. And then it just becomes about, are you getting the right visuals? Are you matching the language that filmmakers care about? And that, those things start to matter a lot more than just like the pure horsepower of the model, basically.
Interesting. Okay. Because one of the questions I've always had around these things, are like, before I was doing School of Motion, I was a 2D animator. And, when I see what these models can do, a lot of them, the most mind-blowing things I've seen, they look like footage. And that makes sense to me because if you're Google VO2 and you own YouTube, you've trained on billions of hours of real footage. So you have tons of training data. And then 3D animation, it seems like it's getting okay at that. And there's a lot of that out there. But then if you ask it to make a 2D animated thing, especially if it's some abstract thing like an ad, like where it's shapes moving in interesting ways, it can't really do that. And I always assumed it was because there's just not enough of that out there to train, and every one of those videos is different in some way. There's not really like a set of rules that they follow.
Right.
So is that true? Is my intuition about this correct? And that's what I would say a lot of people watching this interview are probably going to be like nervous about, like, oh, I'm really good at taking shapes and telling a story with them in an abstract way. Is there a possibility that AI models can be trained on enough of that to do that?
It's that kind of thing is definitely going to be more of a challenge. There's efforts to do it, and I think that our perspective on that is that it's less important to train on data like that, more important to bring in enough controls that filmmakers can do that themselves and can kind of figure out how to do these, these kind of mappings and things. But at the end of the day, I think that's a great example of like, these models are good at general things. They're not good at precision. And so when it comes to these, like, especially these very precise things, if you're talking about, like motion typography, I think is a great example, is like, yeah, you can kind of get these models to learn some like vague motion typography and things like that, but it's not, a brand isn't going to use it. Like no major brand is going to use motion typography from a generative video model on their most precious assets, which is their logos and things like that, right? You might use it to do B-roll, you might use it to do things like that, but the core, the most important pieces, those are going to just become more important than ever, right? And so we think about this even on film. Like the example I always give is like set design is when we see these models, because we're working with a number of the top studios now and deploying our tech into some productions, and generally what you're seeing is like, people think that, well, the set designer, suddenly that role starts to go away. Well, no, actually what the set designer is now doing is, instead of I have to build 25 different sets for this production, they can really focus in on the core elements of, let's say, the most important three, right? Mm-hmm. And the model can focus on kind of the rest of it. And I think with stuff like this, it's the same thing. Is this kind of precision you just won't be able to do with these models. They're not built for this. You'll need people to do that, and the people, essentially the folks that are doing that today, will now just get a lot more firepower and will get a lot more tools that will enable them to do that easier and better. That's really what's ultimately going to come from this stuff.
So I want to talk about the sort of legal implications, and I think I can guarantee everyone watching this is going to love that you're actually paying content creators like to license their stuff to train. What about the companies that aren't? And I know that there's still this sort of looming legal like vagary that no one knows how it's going to end, and there have been lawsuits. I think there's been lawsuits for years that have been kind of ongoing, and those things take forever. Do you think there's any chance that the companies that haven't been doing it the way you guys have been are going to get bit in the ass by this in the end? I think, it's a very confusing time right now, for obviously a lot of reasons, especially in regards to when we're thinking about legislation, and things to that effect. There are people with a great deal of power currently that don't believe in copyright law, right? And that have been like quite upfront about that to date. I think that ultimately the most important thing right now is for artists to like, this is the moment to come out and be very, very loud, because what we're talking about is potentially losing protections that we've relied on for over a century now, right? And this is a very real possibility that's coming. And we are just like one small flank of this broad kind of battle around what IP is, but you do now have lots of people that don't really value artistry in that way, and see this as being just another weapon in some random geopolitical thing. So my hope is that I don't want that existing companies necessarily are like get bit in the ass or whatever for this, and obviously for us as a company that would be great, but like that's not I certainly don't wish that on
on our competitors. What I do hope is that this just sets a precedent, and that, our competitors, like, we've been very open that, like, if our competitors want to start licensing artists, like, we will connect them with all of our entire network, right? Like, we're not hoarding that, that curated data or anything to that effect. We would happily extend that. And, we would love to build, like, open data, marketplaces and platforms where artists can come and have avenues. Like, one thing that I've loved through this exercise is, like, we're able to monetize most of the data. A lot of the data that we're monetizing is, like, throwaway footage for a lot of people. It's, it's studios that have created, let's say, an hour of footage, and they're only using, like, 2 minutes of it in their music video or their ad or whatever it is. But they have all this other, like, amazing footage that's just kind of sitting there. And for us, that's gold, right? And so you've had these, like, small agencies that are suddenly able to get, like, recurring revenues in the, like, the 5-6 figure ranges, right, for data that was otherwise just sitting that. I love that. And I would love if we can build a real economy around this so that artists can consistently build, real wealth on top of, the IP that they're creating, rather than it just going and being used wholesale to, to create these models. So what I would say is, I really hope that artists can be loud, and this is kind of the moment to do that, because I think a lot of these decisions are going to be made in the next year or so. Now is kind of the time.
I love, I was thinking of another story I heard about. I forget what company it was, but they, they made lumber, and they had all this sawdust, and they were trying to figure out what to do with it. And they turned it into like wood pellets that run like furnaces, and made even more money doing it that way. That's kind of interesting, because you're right. I mean, for animators, there's a lot less of that, the stuff you didn't use just because it's so time consuming. But for production companies and filmmakers, God, they must have 100 times what they've actually put out. I want to talk about because I'm glad you brought up the IP protection thing, because this is something that just hit my radar. As of this recording, I don't know, maybe something happens or hasn't happened by the time it runs. But, what I've been hearing, and you'll probably know more than me, is that, I think it was Sam Altman made some kind of post about, like, we need to basically get rid of IP laws. They're outdated or something like that. I'm probably misquoting it, but it was something along those lines. I know Elon liked it or commented. And I was actually kind of shocked to hear that from tech people, because the whole model of Silicon Valley is you invest a ton of money in R&D to build something that hasn't existed before, in the hopes you can monetize it. And that IP protection seems kind of critical to that. So I'm curious, like, do you have a steelman for that position? Like, I don't even understand it, to be honest.
The irony of all of this is the same model companies fight doggedly if anybody tries to train on their outputs. And that was, like, the whole thing with DeepSeek and stuff. It's like, it's that's what it kind of boils down to, is a lot of this stuff will sound ideological when it's presented, but in reality, it's just, businesses doing business things. And so I think that this idea that, we're all just going to lose to China because we gave up copyright law, like, it's such an absurd, I think, kind of notion. I think that, especially when you think of how much the entertainment industry and the media industry has just been pure soft power for such a long time. Like,
that's a good way to put
artistry and creativity is at the heart of like the strength of the society. And if we decide that we're just going to throw away what that IP really means, and like, I just don't think these guys are thinking about what the downstream effects of this actually means, right? And again, it comes down to this, like, savior complex that technologists have, that, like, well, we just know these things better than everybody else in the world, and so we're going to come in and just, like, if you don't agree with us, you're stupid, we're the ones that are doing this, and you're all wrong. It's immensely frustrating, but that is what has kind of become the norm in this industry, unfortunately. So I sincerely hope that these are empty words and they don't actually result in anything, but there's a dogfight ahead for our industry, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would be up in arms, and I know that our audience would too. I mean, that I can't even think of a good reason what to have that idea other than what you just said, which I guess maybe I'm naive. It never occurred to me that like, no, they just know that they'll make more money if they can like just rip off everything. And yeah, I totally get it. All right, so let me ask you like the big question. So we've got a really awesome group of students that are taking class right now. Two of them, Eddie Klaus and Sarah Proietti. They ask kind of similar questions, and we haven't really dove into it. We've kind of touched on it, but I haven't really asked you about this. So the vision that you kind of laid out, right, where you've got this visionary, they've got an idea. They have a phone, so they can go out and do some cinematography, and maybe they have some friends who are great actors. They can get some performances. It won't look that great, but now if they can like pair that talent with a tool that gives them really good results with the controllability and all of that stuff, they can make something that looks like it costs $10 million. That's awesome. And when you were talking about the set designer, I was thinking, okay, so you've got the set designer, right? That person might love this because you know what? I normally have to we're doing a period piece. It's set in ancient Egypt. I need to go out and find these things and get research and all that. And you're still going to have to do a lot of that anyway. But now I don't literally need a model maker to make a giant 30-foot tall statue of Ra for this set. I can, I can have maybe a 3D artist do it, or the AI can generate 10, and I pick the one I like and we place it. So at a certain level in that industry, in the pecking order, this is great. But what about the people below that? And I'm wondering what you think about that. The people that are actually out there making the models, moving the lights around, all that stuff. Because, I can totally see, and I'm very fortunate to be at this place in the industry, but I remember being the low man on the totem pole, where it was I didn't really get to pick what I did. It was just do this right now. What if an AI tool can kind of do that? And so I'm wondering how you kind of think about that, that issue.
Yeah. 100% there's going to be some jobs today that people are doing that won't really be as relevant in a few years. And it's the reality of this industry. It's the reality of automation generally, obviously. And we saw that with CGI as well, although I don't think it's quite as much.
Right.
I think my impression is that the number of actual quote unquote jobs that won't exist 5 years from now, in general, there's going to be a lot less kind of loss than people expect from these models. However, without a doubt, there's going to be kind of a line of things that'll go. I would say kind of two things to that. I think the first piece is the most important thing for us right now as an industry is to make that transition as easy as possible to the people that are kind of at the heart of that, right? And so I think that we, and when I say we, I mean companies like us, need to be working closely with the industry to, for instance, work on re-education programs, to work on new licensing standards, and basically figure out what are these jobs that today we're doing that we expect that maybe a year or two from now we won't be, and let's figure out a transition plan, and let's commit resources and funding and whatever, so that the people that are in those roles today have, we're able to work with them to figure out, okay, once this happens, what is the next step, and how do we kind of transition towards that? The second piece I would say is that, as with automation generally, I think that while you do lose certain things that you'll be doing today, I think that you're going to suddenly get new roles and new things that open up that don't exist today, right? And typically, I think those roles are going to be much more orchestration level roles, but there's just there's these very small things that are already starting to happen where, Comfy UI as an example, and I'm not sure if you guys use that or used it, but it's kind of this standard toolkit that's being used in a lot of AI driven filmmaking. And this toolkit is now becoming there's professional full-time comfy UI people that have, that know how to use these tools. And so in general, for sure, there's going to be roles that change. But I think there's going to be a lot of new roles that are going to emerge. And again, I think that it kind of goes back to your example of the trains and the coal is that, what happens now when suddenly thousands of agencies are now going to be able to be economically viable, whereas before they couldn't be, right? And they're going to have to hire set designers, they're going to have to hire these different people that before they wouldn't have, right? And so I think you're going to see a flourishing of jobs and work, in this industry, whereas before it was like, if you want to work on the biggest, the biggest things that are happening, you have to go to LA, or maybe New York or, a handful of places. And you probably have to know somebody. You have to work your way up to one of maybe 12 different places. Mm-hmm. And then that's kind of where it is, right? Whereas now I think we'll be able to get to a place where like most place, wherever you are, there's probably a community of like really interesting work that's happening and that you can be a part of that. Right. And the roles are definitely going to change in some way or form. But I think that the accessibility and the access of that is going to open up in a way that it hasn't before. And that's kind of where we need to lean into more.
Yeah, I hope so, man. And I mean, if we look to history, that's typically what we've seen. It's always scary when you're going through it. Mm-hmm. And then on the other side, you can look back, oh, it was obvious that we were going to have this, this new role, like social media influencers. Of course, that was going to be a thing, YouTubers. So my last question for you, like the way you've described the product and the model and the whole ethics behind it is unbelievable. And I'm sure people watching this are curious about it. So what's the timeline for like our audience to be able to actually play around with this? And just, I'm sure I'll get nagged if I don't ask you, if someone in our audience has a collection of stuff they think that you might want to license, how do they get in touch?
Yeah. So if you have stuff, please email me. We are always excited about new kind of data relationships. My email is naeem@moonvalley.com. So just hit me up there. We'll be releasing our models for general availability probably in around 2 to 3 months. So June, July, around then is the target. We do have early alpha filmmakers that are already using it, and we'll be like slowly expanding out kind of invites there. And so once we're training in some of the control layers right now, but once some of those pieces are in, we'll look internally and we'll love to see if we can potentially give some early passes and stuff to some of the folks in that you're working with, because I think especially folks that are kind of learning in this space right now and students in this space right now, like they're the ones who I think will really drive so much of this tech. So yeah, would love to look at, potentially giving just like early access if people are interested in that.
Thank you so much for checking out this episode. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss any of the amazing upcoming guests we have on the School in Motion podcast or any of the other awesome content we have. Everything we talked about will be in the show notes, and I hope to see you next time.